I haven't done that wrong now. Okay. I think we're live. We are. So I'm just going to go back into my Zoom. Okay, Zoom. So welcome everyone tonight to our event, which marks both St. Patrick's Day and Women's History Month. We're delighted that we have several events this month that will hit both of these auspicious occasions. So we've got tonight with us Dr. Tara McCarthy, who received her PhD actually in our state at the University of Rochester, and she spent a year as a postdoctoral teaching fellow at the writing program there, and 1 year as a visiting professor of history in Buffalo, New York, before joining the faculty at Central Michigan University. Her research and teaching interests are in American women, social reform movements, and immigration. So we kind of cross over there a little bit in our interests. Her current project traces the political activities of Irish American women in the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, and she focuses on both Irish nationalism and suffrage and labor movement here in America as within ethnic organizations. So actually her book was published. We will have copies for sale in the shop here at the museum as soon as they are delivered. So look out for those, and we'll be able to hopefully send them to everyone. So I'm going to mute everyone except Tara, I hope. Tara, you might have to unmute yourself there. And I'm going to share the slides, but let me just make sure that I give you this correct view so that we only see Tara, and then I'll share my screen. So we're ready for you.
All right, great, thank you. Welcome, and thank you for having me. I'm in Michigan, so it is nice to have a chance to talk to people in New York, and I did live in Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. I've never lived in Albany, but I lived in New York for a long time before I ended up in Michigan. I want to talk about the book, and I want to talk about 3 topics. So I'm going to kind of go through them somewhat briefly, but I'm happy to answer questions and get into more detail. I'll go a little bit light on the detail to begin with. First, I want to talk about why I did this project in the first place, because it was a very, very long time working on this project. But when I started it as a graduate student at the University of Rochester, there really hadn't been very much research done on women, and this is Women's History Month. March is Women's History Month. And of course, there's some great scholarship out there already on the Irish and on the Irish diaspora, but not as much on women, at least not women in America. And what had been done on women in America tended to focus more on economic concerns and particularly work. So we do know a lot about Irish women in terms of their immigration experience and in terms of their work experiences, particularly that in the first generation, they often ended up coming young, coming single, working as domestic servants. And then in the second generation, that when they did sort of have social mobility and move up, they often moved into teaching, nursing, clerical work. And so I wanted to do something a little bit different and really focus on activism and political ideas and activities. And so I really started sort of looking at what organizations were Irish women joining, and what movements. And so most of the women I'm going to mention to you are first or second generation, and I go from 1880 to 1920. So you have new, first generation immigrants still coming, and then of course you have their children as well. And so I ended up really with 3 movements. I did also look at the Ladies Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, so I might mention them a little bit too. But I looked largely at 3 movements, as Liz has mentioned, the labor movement, the suffrage movement, and the Irish nationalist movement. And these are not, isolated incidents. I write about them separately, but of course they are intertwined. And in many cases, you'll see that women are involved in more than one of these movements, and organizations are inspired by more than one. So I'll try to get to some of those complexities as I go. What I'm going to do is start with the labor movement and sort of spend less time on that one, but we will come back to it once we talk about nationalism and suffrage, because as I said, they're very much intertwined as well. So the labor movement, I know I caught bits and pieces of some of the discussions of this week. And one of the discussions that I was hearing last night was, about the Irish and unions. We talked about, you talked about unions a little bit. And the Irish were really important in unions. And we know that the Irish were really disproportionately represented in unions. What I mean by that is even as the Irish ceased to be a large portion of the working class, they still dominate, union leadership and union activity. And that isn't just true for men, that's true for women as well. So that when you're looking at the history of the labor movement, particularly the history of the labor movement in the 19th century, you see a lot of Irish names, So some of those first generation women who joined a labor organization, became activists, were Irish. Many of them second generation Irish whose parents had come, but who had grown up largely in the United States. And as they got involved in the labor movement, this brought them into politics and even suffrage in a couple of ways. Even if you're just looking at the late 19th century, there are a number of things that these early union leaders are looking for. One of them is factory inspectors. So they want to get women to be factory inspectors. So that's one movement that's going on within the labor movement. Another is protective labor legislation, which is more 20th century than 19th, but again, really starts in the 19th century. The idea is getting laws that say women can only work this many hours a day, to shorten their their days by getting laws that say they can only work so many hours. And then, of course, the other issue that comes up, which we'll talk a lot more about towards the end, is suffrage. So some of these early, what I'll call them labor pioneers. And Elizabeth, can you advance the slide? Some of these early labor pioneers are the first, or among the very first Irish Americans to start talking about suffrage. So the picture that I have of the two women, that's actually Leonora O'Reilly. If you run into some other pictures of her, there aren't very many in existence. So the one that sort of is best known, I think, is kind of blurry. I like this picture a lot better, is her and her mother. So Leonora O'Reilly was from the city, from New York. Her mother, Winifred, and her father had come from Ireland and actually had a little grocery store, but her father died. And her mother lost the store, and that basically forced her into sewing and into the garment industry. And so young Leonora also worked in the garment industry. And it's really through both the influence of her mother and her experiences in the working class that she became active in the labor movement, starting with the Knights of Labor. And then we'll talk about some other organizations in just a minute. She's not alone in these kinds of stories, though. Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, and many, many other women. I didn't put all their pictures up because I figured I didn't need to teach you all of their names either. And some of you may know some of them or want to ask me questions about them. But many of them have similar stories. They, ended up in factories because they needed to support themselves. They needed to support their parents. And it's through their experience in factories that they started protesting working conditions, unsanitary conditions, unsafe conditions. And you'll see this little group of women, Irish American women, start to embrace suffrage by the 1890s. So although we think of the suffrage movement as, largely sort of middle class Protestant movement, and that's true, particularly in the 19th century, where you do get some discussion of suffrage that early, it tends to be among workers because women want the vote, and they want the vote to improve conditions in the factories. Okay, so the other picture I put up there is a demonstration by the Women's Trade Union League. The Women's Trade Union League was founded in the early 20th century in 1903. One of the founders was a woman by the name of Mary Kenny O'Sullivan. Not surprisingly, she was Irish. Mary Kenny was a bookbinder, I think, by trade, and she ended up in the trade to support her mother. It was just the two of them, and so she worked to support her mother when her mother was ill, and she becomes very, very important in the labor movement. And both of these women, O'Sullivan and O'Reilly, are both active in the Women's Trade Union League, along with many, many other Irish American women. So let's go with the next slide. What I want to do is start to build in my other movements, and then I'll weave them all together for you at the end, because there's a lot of sort of history and a lot to cover. Irish nationalism. What I want to do here again is talk a little bit more sort of in the chronological order about when women got involved, what they were doing. But again, you're going to see some of the same names starting to come up as I go through the movements. For women in America, Irish nationalism had two big waves. It really had three waves in the United States, which really are similar to waves in Ireland, but women in the US are obviously not doing the same kind of things women in Ireland were doing, and some of the timelines are a little bit different. So I'm going to go through the American version of Irish nationalism. The first big wave for women was with the Ladies' Land League. And there were Ladies' Land Leagues really all over the United States. What's interesting about the Ladies' Land League is it was actually started in the US. And the reason it was started in the US is because Delia Parnell and her daughters were living in the US, because Delia Parnell was an American. And her family still owned land here. And so she ends up really living the later years of her life in the United States. And so Anna and Fanny Parnell are living with their mother, but also working on Land League fundraising and things when Fanny comes up with the idea of starting the Ladies' Land League. So it really starts in the United States and then moves to Ireland because Anna goes back to Ireland really to help organize it. As you can imagine, though, because it was the first time women were involved on such a broad scale, there is resistance to women's activities in the Land League. And one of the main reasons there's resistance to it is because it's seen as a political cause. That, land reform is sort of in itself a political issue, and women aren't supposed to be involved in politics. That's the whole reason why the suffrage movement was so controversial, right? And so it's around the same time, it's the early 1880s. And so there's a lot of resistance, both in Ireland and in the US, for women getting involved. But women are getting involved, and they're getting involved in large numbers. Now, what are they doing in the United States? They're doing fundraising, they're doing education, they're doing sort of more cultural nationalism types of things, like talking about Irish history, talking about Irish language preservation. But they're also in some cases endorsing land reform, getting involved in politics. And although there's not a direct connection to the suffrage movement, there again is overlap. So some of the women who are involved in the Ladies' Land League will also be interested in suffrage, and you will see some crossover there, which is another interesting crossover. There's also crossover with the labor movement, because both of these movements, the Land League movement and the labor movement, really are taking off and getting big in the 1880s. So there's crossover there as well, okay? Now, the Land League doesn't last very long, but what I argue is it's really significant for Irish American women, because it's really the first time that women get together in large numbers, form organizations, declare themselves sort of independent, separate ladies' branches, run their own branches, speak in public for the first time. Many of these kind of activities, Irish American women hadn't really had the opportunity to do before. And so it gives them this not only a purpose, but this kind of sense of what other possibilities there are out there. And so I argue that this is a kind of a watershed moment for women to kind of insist that they have the right to be active in public. In other words, that despite the criticism, and there are some criticisms, that women are insisting that they have the right to go out there and do the work, whether they're seeing it as political work or they're seeing it as charitable work. And certainly people are arguing both sides of that. Now, when the Land League declines, women don't disappear, but it does become a smaller group of women, so that you'll still see women involved, either with supporting the Irish Parliamentary Party, or with supporting cultural nationalism. Lots of interest in Gaelic language, the Gaelic League, also interest in Irish history. And so you'll see a lot of women doing this kind of activity through nationalist organizations or through the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, now called the Ladies' Ancient Order of Hibernians, but it was called Auxiliary at the time, so I tend to call it that, which was first recognized as a national body in the 1890s. So again, it has kind of a different history than the AOH in Ireland. because the women weren't involved in the AOH in Ireland at the time. So they actually got involved in the American AOH earlier than they did in Ireland. And so you see the women who really come to sort of national recognition through the ladies AOH are also, not surprisingly, the ones who are talking about Irish history, the ones who are talking about Irish language, and later, particularly in the 20th century, will be the ones talking about Irish independence as well. And so one of the things that I did was kind of look at who the presidents were, what they were up to, you know, and many of those women were also Irish American. One of the presidents of the ladies AOH was a teenager when she left Ireland, but the rest were largely either born here or came very young. And so in this sort of middle time period from roughly the mid 1880s until, you know, the early 20th century, you have parliamentary nationalism and cultural nationalism being sort of the main activities. And you do have women in them. They're just harder to find. They're definitely harder to find. And then things start to really pick up again. And they pick up again, you know, in two waves. The first wave is when the Irish, largely in New York, but in other areas as well, found the first branches of Cumann na mBan, you know, inspired by, you know, women in Ireland, but also because Irish women were coming to the United States. So we have to keep in mind that in addition to Irish American women, we have Irish women who are spending time in the US and then go back to Ireland. Okay, so we do have a lot of influences coming from Ireland as well. And so the first American branches are founded in New York. And then after 1916, of course, you have an explosion of sort of nationalist organizations and activity. So I'm going to talk about the sort of the last phase of Irish nationalism, and then I'll move on to suffrage after that. And then I'll start to pull them all together for you as well. What you have particularly after 1916 is not only the development of large Irish nationalist organizations, particularly the Friends of Irish Freedom, but you also have some small groups that are not as well known, that are kind of doing their own thing outside of the sort of the direction of the Friends of Irish Freedom. And then you also have some more labor and suffrage connections going on with nationalism. So the pictures that I have for you on the PowerPoint there are largely coming from 1920. And what you have is really a couple of big waves of protest done by Irish American women and women from Ireland. I gotta say, it's hard sometimes to kind of explain which is which, but they're all mixed in together in these organizations. But protests on behalf of Ireland and what's going on in Ireland at the time. So the picture of the women seated on this slide is actually a group of women who were ejected from the House of Representatives, who were there protesting at the House of Representatives, who were kicked out. And then, of course, the other picture you see is women in front of the White House. And there were a number of these picket activities going on in 1920. So I want to talk about a couple of the activities that they were involved in. The first big wave was in Washington, D.C. So either in front of the White House, House of Representatives, in front of the British Embassy. All of these places were spots for protest. There was a man by the name of William Maloney, who was I believe had Irish parents, but had been a doctor in the British Army. And he was an Irish nationalist who was in 1920 encouraging women to come and protest in DC to try and get recognition for the Irish Republic was the big issue. And then also opposition to the League of Nations. And so he was encouraging women to do that. And so there was this you know, kind of explosion of activity surrounding that. But when that was over, the women didn't just say, okay, we're done. They continued to protest in different places and different groups. So there were protests in Boston, there were protests in DC, and there were protests in New York. One of the protests they did in New York was actually a boycott, so that they were protesting down at the docks, trying to get longshoremen not to load any cargo on British ships. So that one's pretty well known as well. And so that was being led by some of the same women that we see involved in the labor movement. Leonora O'Reilly was there. Dr. Gertrude Kelly, who's getting a lot of attention now in terms of her support for Irish nationalism, she was there as well. And a lot of other, what I would call sort of labor left people. So there's a group of left-leaning to radical labor activists who were also involved in the Irish nationalist movement. And so they didn't really answer to the Friends of Irish Freedom. They kind of did their own thing. But, in this case, we're talking just specifically about women doing these protests, and women sort of evoking the memories of, the suffrage protesters of a few years before that, who were being arrested, picketing outside the White House. So what you see in the Irish nationalist movement in this sort of long history, 1880 to 1920, is waves of activism with two big kind of waves at the beginning, at the end, the Land League for one, and then all of the picketing and the strikes for another. But women continue to be active in between those in the Irish Progressive League, in the Gaelic League, and in other Irish organizations that were sponsoring cultural nationalism and also political nationalism. And what you see particularly around the World War I to 1920 time period is really what I would call a resurgence of the kind of the labor left. In other words, that those voices that had been more quiet during the sort of heyday of cultural nationalism and parliamentary nationalism, which are not the same thing, but are going on at the same time, right? That those voices are the loudest again in the sort of 1916 to 1920 time period. So my last movement then, and then I'll sort of tie these together and also answer lots of questions, hopefully, is the suffrage movement. Now, the suffrage movement, again, has a long history of its own. We tend not to think of it we tend not to think of Irish women or Catholic women when we think of the suffrage movement. So I'm going to try and complicate your understanding of the suffrage movement a little bit. I've already conceded that in the 19th century, you're not finding a lot of Irish American women or a lot of Catholic women in the suffrage movement. That is true. And when you do, and you have to look really hard for them, they tend to be labor leaders who are interested in the vote to help working women. However, and this is the big however, the suffrage movement itself kind of takes a turn in the early 20th century. And what I mean by that is that by, let's say, about 1907 is sort of going to be my starting date for you, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But 1907 to say 1915, so not a long amount of time, but fairly late in the movement, you start to get a lot more overlap between the suffrage movement and the labor movement. And this is intentional really on both movements' parts. In other words, the suffrage movement realizes that it needs to do a better job talking to working class women and different ethnicities. Working class women also start to become more active in terms of wanting the vote. And so these two things are going on at the same time. And I would say the third thing that happens, and why don't we, Elizabeth, why don't we go to the next slide? I would say the next one after that. The next thing that happens is sort of an increase in suffrage militancy in the United States. So in other words, American suffragists who in the 19th century were sort of very proper and gave speeches and had teas and, wrote newspapers, were starting to take to the streets more by the 20th century. And so what you see here in these pictures is Irish American women who became really important in the suffrage movement because they're the ones out there giving the speeches. They're the ones out there marching in the parades. They did, I had a picture, I couldn't get it for you for this one, but I had a picture of Mark Foley in a hot air balloon, going up in a hot air balloon for suffrage, So they're the ones doing this, really public stuff. And the reason for that is because the suffrage movement in this time period is heavily dependent on state suffrage campaigns. In other words, the federal amendment strategy hasn't really been revived yet. And the suffrage movement is relying on state by state suffrage. So when I teach this to my college students, I say, okay, you want to get women's suffrage, how are you going to do it? And they kind of look at me, and I'm like, well, how are you going to change the law, right? What do you need to do to change the law? Well, a federal amendment is great if you can get one, but if you can't get one, how else can you change the law, right? Well, the suffrage movement couldn't get the federal amendment. They actually tried it in the 1880s without success. And they gave it up for a long time. They didn't even try. So they focused on state by state by state campaigning in the hopes of changing the law in just that one state. That means you have to mount a big campaign. You got to get a lot of speakers. You got to raise a lot of money. You got to hold a lot of rallies. And in many of those cases, it would still be defeated. So in the first 20 years of trying, the suffrage movement got 2 states, 2. And in the next 20 years of trying, they got 2 more states. So first 40 years, 4 states, right? So it was slow, it was expensive. You can understand why women would start to say, wait a minute, why are we doing this? Let's go back to the federal amendment strategy. But by the 20th century, things did gain steam somewhat. But what I think suffragists came to understand is you're never going to get New York or Massachusetts or Illinois if you don't really reach working class men, immigrant men, Catholic men, Jewish men. In other words, they started to intentionally try and really reach out. And the suffrage referenda failed in New York in 1915, despite of all their efforts, but it did pass in 1917. So New York, finally, women in New York finally get the vote in 1917, only 3 years before the federal amendment. But in New York City, they're really mobilizing ethnic women, Irish Catholic women, Jewish women, etc. And so who are these women? Well, not surprisingly, they find these women in the labor movement. They find them in the labor movement, right? So they are Leonora O'Reilly and Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, who I've already told you about. And I'm gonna introduce you to a couple more. So the woman standing and pointing here is Margaret Hinchy. She was living in New York, but Irish by birth. She was first generation Irish. She worked in a laundry until she was blacklisted for her union activities and ends up with the Women's Trade Union League, which I mentioned before was founded in the early 20th century by Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, among others. She was one of the main Irish Catholic voices for suffrage in New York. In fact, Leonora O'Reilly was kind of her mentor. And so when people would write to Leonora O'Reilly and say, we're having a big Catholic event, we need a speaker, she would say, okay, I'll send Margaret Hinchy. And so her job was really to get out there and talk to Irish Catholic audiences. The woman next to her, the taller one, is Margaret Foley. Margaret Foley was from Roxbury, Massachusetts. And she also, again, had worked, in the union movement, had been through the Women's Trade Union League before she came to suffrage as a speaker. And they actually, the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association, actually sent her and another woman who is not Irish, but sent them to Britain to sort of train with the militants there and observe what was going on there and bring more militant techniques back to Massachusetts. And so around 1911, 1912, somewhere around there, they started what the newspapers called a heckling campaign. They would send these women out to heckle local politicians. So these guys are mostly Irish Catholic machine politicians, right? Local aldermen and things like that. And so Margaret Foley's job was to go and heckle them, and basically, just keep harassing them till they would take a position on suffrage, right? They would try not to answer her questions. She would keep bothering them. And they even sent women against the gubernatorial candidate. They sent women like from stop to stop. I can't remember who it was, the man who was running for governor at the time. Every city he went to, there they would be. And then he would go to the next city and there they would be. And we just followed him around Massachusetts to try and get him to commit on suffrage. So these are some of the techniques that they were using in a much more militant way. Open air meetings, in other words, meetings that are outside. You don't rent a hall, you don't charge admission, you go to where the people are and you speak outside. Suffrage parades. There were no suffrage parades in the 19th century. It's really not till the 20th century that women get out there and start to go on parade. Heckling, and then all the other stuff like, the hot air balloon that I mentioned. There was a trolley campaign where women stood on the back of the trolley and spoke at every station. So these kinds of much more creative and much more politically inspired campaigning were really, for Americans, pioneered in the 20th century, but also inspired in many cases by more militant activities, either on the British side or on the labor side. As well. So socialists were already doing open air meetings before suffragists started to do them, right? But again, what I would argue is this is a really significant moment because as these state campaigns are gaining so much steam in the early 20th century, they are looking for working class women, They want women who belong to unions. They want Irish women. They want Catholic women, because those are some audiences that they're targeting, especially in New York. And so this is one of the big contributions that they make. Next slide. Okay. The other thing that happens in the 20th century is the development of Catholic suffrage organizations. Now, this has not been written about very much, and I wish I could find more than I did, because I'm convinced it's out there, but sometimes as a historian, you have to accept that you're not going to find it. You know, you try, but you can't. But I know that there were a few. What happens is that you start to have the first Catholic suffrage organizations. And again, they don't start in the United States. There was one in France, there's one in England, there's one in Ireland. I want to say maybe Italy, but there are several. And then in the US, you start to have a few as well, where Catholic women are going to work for the vote as Catholics. So you have kind of a separate Catholic, much smaller, but a separate Catholic movement. One of these groups was in New York City. It started as a welfare organization called the St. Catherine's Welfare Organization. So they were interested in, you know, reform for working class women and things like that. But around 1915, they stop and say, you know what, we're just going to focus on the vote right now, because women need the vote. And there's the best way to help working class women is for women to have the vote. So we're just going to focus on the vote. And the president of that organization is Sarah McPike. So I did find a picture of her, not the best one, but I think the only one out there. She was like an executive secretary for GM or something like that. She was a single woman. She was active in Catholic organizations, active in social reform organizations, and a suffragist. And then this is, I didn't picture her. I'll tell you about her in just a minute. But the other one would be Margaret Foley, who you saw on the last slide. Margaret Foley was an organizer for a group called the Margaret Brent Suffrage League, which was out of Massachusetts. And the Margaret Brent Suffrage League was founded later than some of these others, more like 1919, basically right on the cusp of suffrage. But again, it was focused on Catholic women. The name Margaret Brent was a reference to the first Catholic women to ever ask, the first woman to ever ask for the vote in colonial America who happened to be Catholic. She was in Maryland. She was a large property owner. She argued she should be able to vote based on the fact that she paid taxes and had this large estate. The Maryland Assembly said no, but her name was Margaret Brent. And she was Catholic. So Catholic women kind of used her, that symbol of her. And so the Margaret Brent Suffrage League was founded sort of in her honor. But the whole purpose of it was to recruit Catholic women to speak for suffrage, but also to promote the idea of suffrage for Catholic women. And so along those lines, I put this other picture here. The woman with the glasses is a woman by the name of Mary O'Toole. She went on a pilgrimage, essentially is what I would call it, to the home of Margaret Brent. They had a group of suffragists from Washington, D.C., had like a old covered wagon or something, and they basically rode it to Margaret Brent's old home to raise attention for suffrage. And Mary O'Toole at the time was young, and she was in some college suffrage league, but she goes on to become a judge in Washington, D.C. So again, not very well known, but I think she was the first woman judge in Washington, D.C. or something like that. So she had a pretty illustrious career afterwards. She was Irish born as well. And the whole idea of her activism sort of, and again, invoked that idea of Margaret Brent as well. So I think one of the interesting things about the history of the suffrage movement that we really haven't known as much about, doesn't get as much attention, is that by the 20th century, you really do have different groups of women getting involved in suffrage, and for different reasons. Working class women want the vote for different reasons than middle class women maybe want that. Even middle class Irish Catholic women sometimes argue for the vote in different ways than working class Irish women would argue that they want the vote, right? But they're all involved in the same movement. And because women don't have the vote, they need to convince men to pass suffrage legislation, right? So they need, all the voices that they can to go out there and convince men to vote for suffrage. And it's really not until around 1915 that you really sort of have a kind of a switching in strategy from the state strategy to the federal amendment strategy. And part of that is sort of a conscious decision that if we can get some big Eastern states to pass suffrage and add that to all the votes we already have in the West, we can start putting national pressure for a federal amendment strategy, right? So that this strategy starts to kind of pay off once New York enfranchises women in 1917. And then of course the federal amendment doesn't pass until 1920, or doesn't become law. I'm sorry, it passes in 1919, but it doesn't become law until 1920. So we just had our flurry of, you know, suffrage anniversaries, because the 1920 election was the 100th anniversary of women voting. Women voted nationally for the first time in the 1920 presidential election. But of course, most of the Western states already had suffrage. You know, I mean, Massachusetts didn't have suffrage. Michigan did, right? I think it did, 1918, I think. New York did 1917. But a lot of the Western states, the big Western states, had already had suffrage for quite a while by then. And so by 1920, with the triumph of the suffrage amendment, but also I would call the kind of slow dissolution of the Irish nationalist movement, which I'll mention why in just a minute, and the decline of the labor movement, that was kind of the obvious place for me to stop. Because after World War I and the Red Scare, you know, the labor movement goes into decline, right? Progressivism as a whole goes into decline in the 1920s. The Irish nationalist movement goes into decline. There's a lot of fighting in the US for who's going to be in control of the Irish nationalist movement, and surprisingly, none of those people are women, right? So you don't really, the organizations sort of, they sort of fall apart between 1920 and 1922. And then the suffrage movement is done. So once the suffrage movement is done, a lot of those activists start to move their attention into more educational crusades, educating people about the vote, citizenry, that kind of stuff. So I tell my students I turn into a pumpkin at 1920, and that's still true. I just don't ever do anything at 1920. But for this particular project, it was kind of the perfect ending point, because all of these women sort of go their own ways in most cases after 1920. So I think that's about how long I want to go, but I want to leave lots of time for questions if you have them.
Great. So we're all back.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Was there a contradiction between Irish Catholicism and the suffragette movement? Or did people see those things as consistent?
There was a lot of concern, particularly if we go all the way back to the 19th century. There is concern that if women get the right to vote, that Protestant women will outvote Catholic women. So in other words, there's concern that if women get the right to vote, because it's largely a middle-class Protestant movement, that you're essentially going to be adding to the Protestant votes, right? So in places like, New York and Boston, they don't, that many Catholics don't want suffrage for that reason. They see it as a Protestant movement. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Now Catholics, I think again, have an interesting history with the suffrage question. What you see if you look at Catholics, I write about Irish women, but I try to keep an eye on what Catholics are talking about so that I, can inform both. Starting in the 1890s, you start to see more discussion of the sort of the Catholic woman question and how are women supposed to behave and what about suffrage. So you will get some women arguing for suffrage, Catholic women arguing for suffrage starting in the 1890s. But, you get plenty of women also arguing against it. So it's kind of a slow movement among Catholic women. And part of that is, I think, because Catholic women get organized later than Protestant women do. So if you look at the suffrage movement, if you look at the temperance movement, if you look at the settlement house movement, are there Catholic women in all those movements? Yes, there are, but it's later. So the timeline is just different. So that particularly after 1890, you get more discussion of Catholic women getting involved in social reform, getting involved in settlement houses, and that kind of stuff. And you also just get more Catholic organizations. So if you're interested in the history of Catholic organizations, like the Ancient Order of Hibernians or the Daughters of Isabella, those kind of organizations, they become national in the 1890s for the first time. So they're just not, you just can't find them before the 1890s. You just don't know what they're up to because they're just too hard to find. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Tara Rita says that I was at your lecture in Notre Dame sorry.
I tried not to go too heavy on the suffrage this time, but I guess my confession is I've done a bunch of suffrage lectures in the last year. So
she said both lectures extremely informative, and thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
It was a compliment.
Yes.
Notre Dame, I meant Notre Dame. Wow.
This is the last time I think that's the last time I traveled. I just really, yeah, before the pandemic and everything.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm lucky I got a chance to go.
I'm just looking at Facebook as well in case anyone has a question over there. But does anyone on Zoom have a question before I ask one?
I'm particularly interested in the issue of Irish immigrants and Irish women in America as domestic servants, and I'm wondering if you have particular sources that you think are really useful for us sort of understanding their any kind of reform initiatives in that professional sphere.
The classic work, the original kind of pioneering work on Irish women in America is called Erin's Daughters in America. It's by Hasia Diner. And she talks a lot about domestic servants in there. And that's an older book. I mean, it's been around for 30, 35 years probably. But it's sort of the beginning book. More recently, there's a book from Syracuse University Press, and maybe Elizabeth.
Janet Nolan's book?
No, but there's one specifically on domestic servants, and for some reason I am blanking on the title of it. I think it's just called The Irish Bridget.
Oh, so Margaret Lynch Brennan wrote one.
Yes, that's the right title, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So if you're interested in domestic servants, that would be the book to look at. And the thing about her work is she goes more into the 20th century, so she has a lot more. Whereas I think Diner's is strongest on the 19th century, the earlier stuff. And so Margaret Lynch Brennan does more with the early 20th century. So that gives you a better sense. I think those two books give you a better sense of, domestic servants and their lifestyle. Now, as far as like unions and organizations and stuff, the other book I really like is Laura Vapnick's book called Breadwinners, which isn't on Irish women specifically, but talks a lot about Leonora O'Reilly. And I think she has a chapter in there on domestic servants too, because they really didn't unionize. I can't remember, it's been a long time since I looked at that book. So, but anyway, check that one out, or at least look at the table of contents and see if that one might interest you. I really didn't look at domestic servants at all because that, had been done quite a lot already and it wasn't what I wanted to do. But I tend to run into a lot of teachers. So, I mean, I think that's Janet Nolan's books, right? Again, and I'm very much interested in teachers now, I think partly because of Janet Nolan's book, but so that's another area that I think is really an interesting way to look at as far as careers and sort of economic issues and union issues. So Janet Nolan's book, which is called Servants of the Poor, is that right?
Yeah,
no, that's a different book. It's called
Ourselves Alone, I think. Is that the one that she wrote?
No, she has two.
Okay.
She's one is different teachers.
Yeah.
You know what? Yeah, sorry, I'm not in my office. I had to come down to a classroom to see the PowerPoints behind me, so I'm not in my office right now. But or yeah, you can always, Elizabeth can email me and I can grab it off the shelf too. But Janet Nolan is the author. Yeah, she has two books. The first one is on immigrant women, like Diner's book, more first generation women. The second one's on teachers specifically. And for some reason, I'm blanking on the title on that one.
Okay, thank you.
We had a question as well in Zoom. What effect did the suffrage movement in England have on the suffrage activism in the US?
I think the militancy was something that some American women embraced. So that, again, that militancy that comes to the US, it didn't just happen. The US is watching what's happening in other countries and particularly experimenting with more militant techniques based on the British movement. and based on the fact that some from the British movement visited the United States. So, you know, again, one thing to consider is that none of this is done in isolation. It's not just that they knew of each other. In some cases, they're visiting each other or they're writing to each other, right? So that there was a woman, a radical from Britain, who came and actually gave some talks in New York City. And then they formed a group called the American Suffragettes, which was a direct inspiration out of the British movement. And one of the women who formed that group was an Irish woman by the name of Maud Malone, who's also, I didn't get a picture for you, but she's in my book as well. She's a fascinating character. She started interrupting political rallies, like, and not just local people, but like Roosevelt Wilson during the election of 1912. She just like would barge in and be like, why don't you talk about women's suffrage, or why don't you, you know, support women's suffrage? And they just had her hauled out of there. I mean, she was arrested for breaking up these political meetings. It was actually, I think it was Wilson who had her arrested, but she did the same thing to Teddy Roosevelt. And so the local media started calling her the lone suffragette because she broke with the organization and was kind of on her own. She wasn't in any organization. And she just did what she wanted to do, you know, broke up meetings, and she didn't serve any jail time, but she did end up getting arrested many times, including with the pickets in Washington, D.C. and the hunger strikes with the National Woman's Party. So she was involved in suffrage on all levels. But she was an Irish nationalist as well, and her father was an Irish nationalist. Her uncle was a pretty well-known New York priest as well. So she had a kind of a really interesting family history as well.
So I just checked, Janet Nolan, it is Servants of the Poor, which is Teachers and Mobility in Ireland and Irish America. And the other one is Ourselves Alone, Women's Immigration from Ireland.
That's those are the two Janet Nolan books. So have a little library. They're all my favorite books, of course.
Yeah. Then Sharon asks, did you find any women's activism as teachers, railroad workers, coal miners, or steel workers?
Yes, I mean, it wasn't specifically, yeah, I mean, I wasn't really looking at those things, and I didn't write very much about Mother Jones, even though I'm interested in Mother Jones, because I chose to do portraits of movements. She only shows up in the labor movement, right? She doesn't show up in the suffrage movement because she really, I mean, for her, suffrage is a bourgeois movement, and she's not interested in that, so she doesn't really show up. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, same thing, right? She shows up for the Irish nationalist movement a little bit, but more for the labor movement, but she doesn't show up in the suffrage movement. So, so some of the women that I use are lesser known because they go through my movements, right? Teachers is, I think, the most obvious one because Janet Nolan has done a lot of work on that because Irish American women were so really predominant in teaching. And I'm starting to do a little bit more research on that myself as well, not just on Irish American women, but on whole teachers organizations. So that I can look at the kind of the bigger picture as well. But teachers organizations for sure. So Margaret Haley out of Chicago has gotten the most attention. She was Irish, she was Catholic, she was a suffragist. And she was also a pioneer in not only teachers' rights, but getting teachers to join trade unions. So that there were teachers organizations that weren't necessarily affiliated with trade unions, right? But she decided to go the union route and affiliate with the Chicago Federation of Labor. So teachers, yes, I ran into teachers, and I wrote somewhat about teachers, not specifically about miners or anything like that, though. A lot of the working class women that I write about, I found through the Women's Trade Union League, because again, it's very hard to find these women, and you have to go where the papers are. And so that limits you somewhat. But so women who were active enough to end up in the Women's Trade Union League, the Women's Trade Union League has wonderful papers, letters, diaries, all that kind of stuff, all saved, all on microfilm, all available. So that's great. For a historian, that's, that's the mother lode. And so that's where, Leonora O'Reilly, Margaret Foley, Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, that's where all those women come from, Women's Trade Union League.
It's very difficult. We had a comment on Facebook too about Nora's watching from Troy and she's thinking about Kate Mullaney, but we don't even have a photograph of Kate Mullaney, and so that's it. Like sometimes you know, the story could be broader, but as you say, the sources aren't there. And so if there is a record, you know, and you know, I'm thinking of women like Inez Mulholland and Lucy Burns, you know, both Irish as well, but possibly only interested in the voting aspect, you know, so it doesn't go across all of the movements.
Right, and Lucy Burns is actually somewhat frustrating too, because unless you can really wade through those huge suffrage collections, it's hard to find stuff on her.
Yeah.
Not very many historians have written about her, and so she definitely, I mentioned her. I definitely mention her, but again, she doesn't sort of get. I know she deserves a lot of attention.
Yeah.
But I can't.
Alice Paul gets everything, and she's right next to her in the picture. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Right. She deserves more attention, but I think maybe the sources either aren't there or are very hard to. You know, these suffrage collections are vast.
Yeah.
And I didn't really use them. Right. I used more Irish American papers, Catholic papers, and then specific women's papers. But I didn't go fishing in, you know, the NWP papers, which someone maybe could still do, because that would be a great project. But yeah, she gets a mention, but not a lot of attention.
Yeah. Well, that was going to be my question. You know, the intersection or the lack of intersection of class, I think, is very important with these women. You know, and so it is kind of an interesting, you know, phenomenon that maybe it is sort of the higher class or the middle class women that lead certain aspects of certain struggles, and even how they frame suffrage among themselves. You know, like there's, well, it's my role to be a dutiful wife and mother, but you know, so how important is the vote? You know, so do you want to talk a little bit about class and how you found that in your work?
Yeah, I think, well, one of the things that is really important is the triangle fire, which I teach a class now on women in work, and I have my students write about the triangle fire. And one of the things that happens after the triangle fire is women, particularly working class women who've already been involved in the labor movement and the suffrage movement, they get, you know, like frustrated, right? Because you've worked so hard, but yet so little has changed. And so one of the things that comes out of that, specifically for Leonora O'Reilly, is that she founds a wage earners suffrage league. And hers is not the first. There was one in California, and there are others. And this has been written about a little bit as well. So there's this little flurry of activity where working class women say, you know what, it's not enough to be in the suffrage movement. We want suffrage organizations by working class women for working class women. So you do have that. These are like lesser stories. They're not well known, but you do have that. So working class women working for themselves. You also, through the Women's Trade Union League, have an awful lot of working class women who are working for suffrage as well. And sometimes they get very frustrated. So Leonora O'Reilly, I keep going back to her because her papers are so good. She quit the Women's Trade Union League more than once because she got frustrated with middle class women who didn't understand what she was trying to explain to them, you know. She kept going back, you know, but she did get frustrated. And ultimately, although I didn't mention it, she gets very interested in Irish nationalism after. So she's involved in all three movements. She's the best example, I think, of someone who moves, you know, right through all three. But by the time she starts getting involved in Irish nationalism, she's well known as a speaker for suffrage and for labor. So, you know, she's kind of a draw. So Leonora O'Reilly's going to speak, you know. And so she's out there at some of these protests as well in the like 1916 to 1920 time period. So she, you know, she's informed by class first and foremost, right? I mean, and the worker struggle, that is her primary commitment. But suffrage is very important to her. And then ultimately Irish nationalism also appeals to her. So she's doing all of those things together and uniting them all. And some of these other women are too, like Margaret Hinchy, Margaret Foley. I mean, they're not prominent in the Irish nationalist movement, but they're certainly sympathetic.
So there was another question from Rita. Can you speak a bit more about the Lady Hibernians, what they were most interested in, and are there any extremely notable women from the Hibernians?
Yes, I mean, I think they're extremely notable, but they've never really been written about. And because I decided to focus my book on these three movements, they're in there, but they're kind of spread out. So I don't have a chapter on them in that book. But my dissertation did have a chapter on them. I'll say a couple things about them, and then you can let me know if there's something you're curious about. One is that women were having their own organizations before there was a national. In other words, there were local either daughters of Erin or, ladies, ancient order of Hibernians locally. But by the 1890s, they wanted to be recognized nationally, and they had to fight for that recognition. They were the ones who went and said, recognize us, recognize us, recognize us. And even after they were recognized, the men continued to handle their funds and essentially be in control for another 10 years. So it wasn't until about 1906 that the women basically won the right to handle their own funds, elect their own officers. So it's really at that point that you start to see who the presidents are. And they're the easiest ones to find, because if you're looking at local press like the Irish World or the Gaelic American or some of these Irish newspapers, they're going to quote the president of the Ladies AOH, right? So they're a little bit easier to find, but none of them left any papers, no letters, no diaries, nothing. So you have to go through newspapers to figure out what they're doing. One of the ones that I really enjoy telling a story, so I'll tell a story, is a woman named Ellen Ryan Jolly. Mrs. Jolly, I used to call her when I was in grad school. Look, I found out about Mrs. Jolly today. She was from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, which is where my parents are from. And she was a kind of an amateur historian. She was really active in the Rhode Island Historical Society, but also really interested in Catholic history. And so she takes on a project to study the role of nuns, women religious, in the Civil War. And she writes a series of essays that appear in like the Irish World and other, newspapers, Irish newspapers. And she ultimately brings that together to a book. So you can actually read her book it's called Nuns of the Battlefield. But more significantly, she decides that they should have a monument to the nuns who served in the Civil War. And so she starts around 1914, I want to say, raising money and lobbying Congress people and, getting various LAAOH, state presidents to push their congressional delegations and such. And it takes about 6 years, but she gets approval. And there is actually a statue, a monument in Washington, D.C. to these women religious who nursed fallen soldiers on both sides of the Civil War. So she, she basically said, we need to celebrate women. We need to celebrate Irish women. We need to celebrate the history of Irish women and Catholic women. And she got that done. So that is actually, I think, a pretty huge accomplishment for someone that no one's ever heard of but me and my roommate from grad school, my dissertation committee, so. And not surprisingly, particularly after 1916, when you get these big, monster meetings of Irish that all come together from all these organizations, when they do have women speakers, which is not that often, it's usually the presidents of the Ladies Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. So Ellen Ryan Jolly, another woman named Mary McWhorter, who was from Chicago. And then there were a couple other women who were paid speakers of the AOH. They were national lecturers for the AOH, with a specialty in Irish history. So they would go around and give speeches and teach people about Irish history. So there are a couple other women like that who are recognized on the national level for their speaking ability, but also for their knowledge of Irish history. Mm-hmm. And so again, they didn't leave any papers. Some of them wrote and left stories, fictional stories, but they didn't leave anything else. And I spent a long time chasing them around trying to find stuff. Yeah. And unfortunately, it's not really there. So if you're interested in the Ladies AOH, you got to go further into the 20th century, which again, I turned into a pumpkin at 1920, so I haven't tried to do it.
So but that was actually a great question where during this time period that you studied, were Irish women more represented in the labor force than other nationalities?
No, not really. I think that's what's noteworthy about the Irish is that particularly by the time you get into the early 20th century, they are not the majority of the working class, not anymore. Mm-hmm. But from what's been studied, at least the Irish men still had the majority of leadership within, labor organizations, even though they were not the majority of the working class. Women haven't really been studied in that way. And of course, there's not much leadership for women anyway in labor organizations, but you see the names, so that when you see the pioneers, who's the first, woman to do this, who's the first woman to do that, they are often Irish American. And then of course the Women's Trade Union League has women of all ethnicities, but a lot of Irish American women in there for the Waitresses League, for the, for some of these other organizations, a lot of Irish American names popping up.
And did this involvement with women, even though it was a smaller percentage of Irish women, did that translate over the decades to being leveraged into professionalism and kind of a presence of Irish American women as leaders or professionals in other fields? Trying to figure out, was that leveraged or did it kind of get shut off when?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I guess my answer would be that Irish American women, when they have social mobility, tend to go into teaching, nursing, more clerical things. So those may or may not be unionized, right? So it's not a direct connection. Eventually you'll have teachers unions, yes, and eventually you'll have Irish American women, leading in some of those cases for unions, but that's a slow process. And that doesn't start in most cases till the 20th century, or at least depending on the city that you're looking at, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't say there's a direct connection, but what I would say is for Irish American women, being active in labor unions brought many of them into other organizations like the Women's Trade Union League, like the Suffrage Movement, like, movements for protective labor legislation, right? If you want protective labor legislation, you got to go and lobby for it, right? You got to get people, to support it. You got to get the governor to sign it, et cetera. So those are the kind of things that Irish American women are doing that is getting them direct experience. So for example, there's a woman by the name of Agnes Nestor. She's from Chicago. She was one of those young women. She was a glove maker. She was one of those young women who actually lobbied for that bill in the state legislature, right? She, would go and she would lobby and she would lobby and she would lobby for those bills to protect working women. Does she move on to bigger things? Yes, she does. She becomes, I'm a little rusty on this, so I can't say exactly, but I think she's the leader of her glove makers union, but she ultimately ends on a labor panel for Woodrow Wilson, right? So her work in Chicago is recognized nationally as Wilson gets interested in, particularly during World War I. Does all of that translate into more power for Irish American women? I mean, I wouldn't say yes. I'm a bit of a cynic on that, but certainly her work is recognized. Is she remembered today? Not really, not very well. But these women in all of these cities, right? I mean, yeah, certainly they do, they do form this nice little generation of activists that are getting stuff done, getting laws passed, maybe that's the best we can hope. But the next generation, they go to normal school, they get their teaching degrees, they go and teach, in the public schools.
But I think, Dr. McCarthy, there's such an interesting, even the fact that you chose 1920 or 1920 chose itself, as the end time, because, you're right, the war is over, the kind of the Irish movement has fragmented here in America, not only because of De Valera's visit, but because they get independence at home in 1921. So, unless you want to kind of get involved with the Civil War there, which there's sort of no point if you're over here, And so there are all the, and then, in one way you could argue that the George Creel, and the, public information people during World War I were sort of successful in minimizing the ethnicities of various Americans, so that you came together, to pull behind America in 1917, to defeat the Hun. So German Americans were invested in losing their hyphen. The Irish have been encouraged to lose their hyphen. And so maybe ethnicity in a way becomes less important, for some of these more established groups. Johnson Reed Act is coming up in 1924, so it kind of all comes together that a lot of the needs have been met. you're being encouraged to not claim your ethnicity, and
Right.
you know, they all fade into the background, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's tremendous pressure, particularly, you know, after like 1916, tremendous pressure for Irish Americans to sort of get on board with the war effort during World War I, right? The whole Wilson and his hyphenated American speech, right?
Yeah.
A lot of Irish were really, really resentful of that, though, right? So that, you know, the people like Mary McWhorter and Ellen Ryan Jolly and particularly the ladies, Ancient Order of Hibernians, are like, what do you mean hyphenated American? They didn't agree with that, and they were arguing that you should, you know, embrace the hyphen and be American and be Irish. And there was a lot of concern that loss of Irishness would lead to loss of Catholicness, right? That if you let go of your Irish heritage, is your Catholic religion next? But I think, adding to what you said, that by, again, the 1920s, some people who do Catholic history have argued that you start to get within Catholic circles more of an interest in celebrating Catholic identity over ethnic identity. In other words, it's, you know, we're all Catholic, right? No matter what ethnicity you are. So I think that feeds in with what you're talking about. There's pressure to leave the hyphen behind, particularly during World War I. And then there's kind of a celebration of Catholic identity, you know, which minimizes ethnic difference. And I'm not saying that's the reality, right? I'm just saying that's the
potential
ideal. By the 1920s, that ultimately kind of ends to Catholic identity that is multi-ethnic.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that, I mean, I think that argument has been made by historians.
Nora mentions the same thing, you know, the anti-immigration wave in the 1920s as that immigration control kind of starts to. So, you know, it's just an interesting sort of confluence of events that conspires internally and externally, maybe to, you know, lead to a natural end. So does anyone else have any questions or comments? There's Nora's here. We have a good few on Facebook, but no one is asking questions. They're very quiet. Anyone here in Zoom? No, it was a fascinating talk, Dr. McCarthy. I really appreciate it. As I say, we'll have the book. They're all clapping. We'll have the book in the store soon, in the museum, and you know, you can support your local bookseller as well. We won't mention the big conglomerates that have it, but Saratoga AOH is telling us thank you. So, you know, yeah, very interesting. We'll definitely have you back, and I'm delighted we were able to celebrate Women's History Month, but also the eve of St. Patrick's Day with you all. So thank you everyone for coming. And when are we back? I don't even know when we're back. Next Monday, I think, with Damien Shields, and he'll talk about the Irish in the American Civil War. And we have next Wednesday, 20 books written in Ireland. So keep an eye on our Facebook page. Thank you, everyone. And they're all saying thank you, Mr. McCarthy. So yeah, delighted to have you. Very interesting. And Mary Ellis is looking forward to the book. So keep an eye on your numbers. They're going to go through the roof.
Thank you.
Good night and happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. Stay safe.
Happy St. Patty's Day.
Good. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Dr. McCarthy, for doing this.
Oh, thank you for asking me.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.